Welcome to the On-Premise IT podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic or on premise, and sometimes even on location or on premises. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT luminaries to discuss a single idea or premise. On today's episode, we're discussing Edge and the fact that it looks awful familiar if you've been involved in cloud and data center, but kind of isn't. Before we get to that premise, though, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Enrico Signoretti. I am an IT analyst and I work for Gigaom. And you can find my write-ups on gigaom.com.
Hi, my name is Allyson Klein. I am the chief analyst for the Tech Arena, and you can find my content at thetecharena.net.
I'm Alastair Cooke, and I'm also an analyst, and I write some of the reports for Enrico. And I spend a lot of my time teaching people how to use cloud technologies, particularly AWS cloud technologies.
And I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT. You can find me on the socials as S. Foskett. And of course, you can find me on the Gestalt IT podcast and news series. So those of us who've been in the industry for a long time have seen the technology, the impact of technologies like virtualization, cloud orchestration, containerization. All of these things have impacted the data center, of course, the cloud, but also the edge. And it would be easy to take a look at what's going on in edge computing and to say, well, that's just the same stuff. It's just It's just a data center. It's just a data center without the data center. Or maybe you look at it and say it's a cloud without the cloud, right? But that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's not the same thing. It is, in fact, a pretty big divergence from what we've seen in the data center. So let's get us started. Enrico, you've seen a lot of data center infrastructure. I'm sure that you see a resemblance here, but it's not the same thing, is it?
I think we are in the first wave of adoption of Edge as we think about Edge. I mean, Edge started with the first compute era. I mean, the first computer that was distant from the data center was Edge already. But actually now we have a lot of technologies and a lot of new options. And there are new deployment models, there are new technologies surfacing, and I'm pretty curious to see how many of these vendors many of them are not yet even available to the public. I mean, we're talking about stealth company trying to use all these resources at the edge that sometimes are underutilized, and they can really build really fancy things. I mean, distributed storage. We talked about this in my reports, but also in the community multiple times. There are plenty of options to use compute at the edge that we are so only scratching the surface, and potentially there are new computing models that we don't even take advantage of. So it's an extension somehow of the data center and the cloud, but actually it's totally different things. So totally that will bring new opportunities to enterprises and organization of every kind.
I think it's important to not view Edge as just being a single thing. I had a conversation with also Tech Field Day delegate Charles Anise on our internal communications and wrote a post about how there are very different edge platforms, and I've tended to categorize a near edge and a far edge. And the near edge looks like a data center. It probably doesn't belong to the person who owns the computers in it, so it'll be some sort of point of presence for a telco or something like that. But it has data center infrastructure and it runs a general purpose platform. The thing that I think is really interesting at Edge is what I categorize as far edge. So it's a location that's not a data center. It's a location that belongs to the owner of the computer. So maybe it's a delivery truck is one of the examples I've heard of, is that there's a whole bunch of sensors and telemetry equipment in there. And that generation of data means it's got to be processed locally. And so there's a much more special purpose platform goes into these smaller locations, be they retail premises, attached to a manufacturing plant, attached to a wind turbine. And the data that's generated has to be processed locally because it's not worth sending the whole lot back to some central location. It's very driven by the applications that are running there. It might be that it's in a retail premises, so there's a lot of surveillance video and stock tracking applications that are running there. And that's quite different to the general purpose platform that we see more at the near edge and into the data center and cloud.
I think that when we look at edge, we need to think about why does it exist and really what is creating this need for a new computing model is trying to bring compute closer to where data is being originated. So all of those sensors in Alastair's example need some analysis and probably need it faster than could be done, or even um, maybe not even tenable to do, um, to bring that data into a cloud, into a data center, and deliver analysis there. That opens up a host of opportunities to deliver innovative business practices for companies if they can actually exploit that data with edge.
And I see a lot of the far edge as being, it's a data refinery essentially. The idea that they're pulling all that data over a relatively slow and a huge number of network connections. So increasing the bandwidth is incredibly expensive. So you do the processing locally, and you get a real-time insight from the local processing, and that might be a Tesla. You don't want to go back to the cloud to decide whether the thing in front of the camera is a pedestrian or not. You need that answer very fast.
And if you think that, earlier today I was with a storage vendor, and they are planning to release a new product that is a federated storage. So they are collecting storage resources across a large network of very small devices, and they are building something out of it. And on top of it, there is a second product on the roadmap that includes Lambda functions. So every time you interact with the storage, you also run function, which is a totally federated kind of cloud. It's a new generation of cloud. I mean, we can use the federated edge or federated cloud. I don't know the word that you can use now, but actually it's impressive. I mean, every time you are at the edge, you can use all these resources that are available there to do minor operations or major operations without going to a central location. At the same time, these data become available to everybody in the federation, which is massive. There are plenty of applications that are possible, that are now require a lot of resources at the core, and the core could be the data center or the cloud again. But we are really changing the model. So this is really the first implementation of the edge that we are seeing. And even when we see Kubernetes at the edge, we are really at the beginning. So there are a lot of now distribution that think about edge deployment, so very tiny, very optimized, with very opinionated also on the component that you deploy, just to solve the problem. We are now starting to see mechanisms to manage this huge number of deployments in parallel. And now the next step is really taking advantage of all these resources.
You know how people used to say the cloud is just someone else's computer? It's true, of course, and the edge is just someone else's computer too. All the things that we're describing are things that do exist elsewhere. But as you're saying, the interesting thing is how they're being used. And so, for example, with Kubernetes at the edge, we're not seeing Kubernetes being used so much as a way to continually manage and operate an environment. We're seeing it more as an abstraction or almost an API for an infrastructure stack and for deploying lightweight applications in sort of a cattle sort of way. So the theory, the philosophy has been adopted and adapted in a new environment. And the same thing is true whether you're talking about HCI technology or, as Enrico mentioned, distributed storage technology. Their companies have been working on this stuff for a long, long time, but the way that it's being used at the edge is really different, and it transforms the technology, in my opinion. Am I wrong?
Completely agree. One of the interesting things to see is that transition that we have seen And we're seeing scale computing tomorrow to see their huge transition. They went from running individual discrete clusters of hyper-converged compute for a single customer, and they've completely turned the company around towards managing vast numbers of small compute clusters. And so they're transitioning towards, they're very much playing in that edge space. And the kind of things that I'm looking forward to in there is there's a whole lot of automation for deployment of the infrastructure on site with Edge. You're not sending this with a technician. You're sending this equipment to site with a courier. One of the Edge vendors I've talked to says that the courier driver should be able to commission it. The other one said that the pizza chef, because like Enrico, in Italy, pizza is an important part of your life. So the pizza chef should be able to deploy the infrastructure. It's a completely different way of thinking than saying even we'll send a junior engineer with the TIM. You just can't afford to do this at this massive scale, the huge number of deployments. So although a lot of the technology looks the same, as Stephen's been saying, the way it's used, the details of how it's implemented are very different because of that massive number of small units of compute you have.
I think that there's also this notion of, some of the core premises of cloud computing are what make edge possible. So Alistair's talking about automation, a core premise of cloud, but the failover aspects of cloud, where if a server goes down in a data center, you just move over to another instance and you're up and running and there's no problem. You may not have that capability at the edge, um, especially at the far edge, where you're not going to be deploying redundant infrastructure on that truck, just to keep using that example. And and I think that's where we have divergence. We have some core capabilities that are absolutely consistent and some core architectures that are absolutely consistent, but because of the environments, and maybe there's some other reasons, but the thing that comes to my mind is because of the environments, the technologies diverge.
Yeah, one thing that is really important is also to understand is that Edge enables to use different type of technologies. I mean, even though there is this rise of ARM processors in the data centers now, because cloud providers are using them heavily now, you see more and more ARM also at the edge. And for different reasons. Of course, one is power consumption, but actually, you have all the same tools that you have on x86 platform, so why not? And this also brings accelerators, etc., because you're looking at efficiency. So yes, on one end, it's different, but actually, uh, you know I saw multiple times very tiny clusters, fully redundant, and and they work perfectly. I mean, you can go there with an hammer, break one of these servers, the rest, you know, works perfectly. And so yes and no. I mean, you have this architecture that are designed specifically for the edge, but the level of redundancy, the level of performance also are striking sometimes. It's incredible because we are adding accelerators, and there are specialized ARM chipsets that have GPUs that are really powerful, because you want to do image recognition, you want to do AI stuff at the edge now. So and there is a lot of development, and you want to do it with an efficiency that is not the efficiency that you usually have in the enterprise data center. So it's there are some really interesting use cases. This week at Edgefield Day, we will see a lot of stuff. But if you think that, for example, at the Mobile World Congress, that is also next week or this week, I don't remember. But anyway, so I'm receiving a lot of news, and everybody talks edge. Everybody talks about optimizing stuff for the edge going there. I mean, it's I remember MWC as a consumer thing at the end. So presenting the latest phone, but actually everybody's talking about enterprise application at the very far edge, how you use 5G deployments, optimized operating system optimized for edge application, and so on. I mean, it's a totally different scenario now.
I think that's a really good point, Enrico. And I think that if you look at where we started, which is, is edge cloud, is it different than cloud? Network could be argued to be cloud. I think the lines have blurred, and MWC certainly reflects that focus on private 5G networks. And I'm looking forward to hearing what folks are saying about that at MWC, because it's a multi-billion-dollar business that's about to hockey stick on us as part of that foundation for the edge. Um, I think that when you consider that, where do you see the lines when you're working with clients on what they're defining as an edge workload and what they're defining as a data center workload? Are there lines in it anymore?
Well, I think there are lines, but it really depends on the type of application and user. And I had this experience with a very what I consider very far edge. I mean, so cluster of very small computers installed, next to welding machines with all the problems that you can think about. So they are controlling the welding machine, they are recording data. The environment is not safe. I mean, from you don't want to stay close to these machines while they are welding, and and there is also gases and other stuff. But they have this stuff, and this is core for this application, for this company. I mean, and this is the very far edge, and then they have what is close to the data center. I mean, so a collection point, because we are talking about dozens of these stations, each one of them with some computing stuff, and then they have the core where they do all the analytics. And so I mean, it's crazy. And it really depends on the application. It really depends on and the edge is full of nuances, I think. And even when you talk with a vendor all the time, you have to ask what kind of edge you're talking about. And trying to remove the marketing from the reality most of the time.
And I think circling back to Alyson's point that this should all be driven by the business requirement. What are we actually doing for the business? Having an edge solution isn't going to do in itself anything if it's not aligned to what the business needs to achieve. And so the lines that we as analysts like to put around this is edge, this is far edge, this is near edge are far less important than what are we doing for the business? How are we actually delivering more value than we're causing cost in this business? How do we enable the business to do things that are going to serve customers better? And for the worst of all words, maximize shareholder maximize shareholder returns or value or whatever the executive phrasing is for that one. But it does come back to that, right? We're in this for business to serve the business, to improve the business and deliver better outcomes for our customers. And these lines don't necessarily help us, but as humans, we like to have some ways of categorizing what we see and to be able to communicate that. That's why words matters, and words matter and definitions matter. But in the end, we've got to be serving an actual purpose.
And it is a very different environment. And I think that it has very different requirements by default because of some of the fundamental natures of the environment. I mean, one of the constraints that is placed, I mean, we're talking about constraints here and what the customer needs are. One of the constraints that's placed on edge computing, of course, is cost. You cannot afford to build out a micro data center and send it out to every restaurant or every warehouse or every school. It just isn't going to happen. That pulls along requirements. Another one of them is, as you mentioned earlier, is the availability of hands-on resources. So things have to be very plug and play. Another one, as Allyson mentioned, was networking and connectivity. It's very different to provision something over in an internet data center with high availability, high performance, always on, unmetered network links than it is to provision something at the other end of a potentially unreliable link, or maybe just something that's reliable but maybe not quite as predictable. uh, all of these things go into what makes edge different. And in terms of definitions, to me, it really is sort of an I'll know it when I see it kind of definition, in that you could argue that a small manufacturing company with a real small IT infrastructure, maybe they're using NUX, maybe they're using hyper-converged infrastructure, scale computing, right? I mean, a lot of their customers are using have a network of just a few small PCs that are running on a little switch and so on. And that's their data center, right? Maybe it's in a closet. Sounds a little bit like edge, doesn't it? But it's not. It's not edge if it's not used as edge, right? It's not if it's not, it doesn't have that unique nature. And I think that for us who are trying to get our heads around it, one of the things that's challenging as well is that nature has changed over time. And so what was acceptable or required, satellite links, big, heavy duty power supplies and UPSs and all that stuff, some of this stuff is no longer required or no longer acceptable, no longer, and so we have to think about that as well. And so all of these things kind of come together to give us a sort of a de facto edge, despite what we want it to be. What do you think of the constraints and how that sort of pushes the infrastructure direction?
The further we get away from cloud and data center, the more we're seeing very specialist physical constraints. So as Enrico mentioned, the machine that is right next to the welding station, well, that's going to have some very specific constraints around power and connectivity because of the environment it's in. And similarly, the computer that you put inside the delivery truck is going to have a lot of constraints. It can't run on mains power. You're probably just going to rely on the battery in the actual truck to provide protection for it. And as Allyson said, you're not going to have that thing redundant. Because you're only going to lose one person's productivity if it fails. So it's not worth spending the money for building a full three-way redundant cluster with geo-replication to another location. That's clearly would be crazy. So the further away from the data center, the more use case specific constraints you're going to see. And then you multiply that by the number of these locations there are. As Enrico said, there'd be a dozen or several dozen welding machines in a single factory, and there may well be 30 or 40 factories, and so you've got hundreds of these implementations. When you start talking about retail businesses and delivery trucks, you're talking about thousands and tens of thousands of locations. And so the little bit of shaving of improvement that you can make at each of those locations multiplies very fast. But also all of the locations are the same. Unlike when we start running in data centers, where each of our data centers is going to be quite significantly different and run different sets of workloads. When we're doing these multiple locations that are essentially cookie cutters of one another, we don't have to redevelop for each one. So we are getting that benefit being multiplied across all of the locations in a way that we don't as much when we're working in data centers.
One of the biggest constraints that we have is support at the edge. I mean, you think about data center, replacing a component, especially on the enterprise view of things. But actually, at the edge, you don't have anybody most of the time. So you have somebody that maybe can replace and unplug and plug a couple of connectors, and you have to hope that they are getting the right port and et cetera, et cetera. But that's what you can get most of the time. So it's easier to ship uh, a new component and replace it, if it's a box, than anything else. So everything changing in the way you treat these devices, they especially also from the security point of view, why everything at the edge is encrypted, because again, you have to replace the component, not and the component could be an entire server, instead of thinking too much about repairing the server.
It brings way more attention to how you automate the management and provisioning of workloads, making sure that those that infrastructure is completely capable of being overseen remotely, because you're not going to be sending IT out to service this equipment readily. And then the other aspect that I think about is security. You are introducing a tremendous amount of additional attack points into your infrastructure. And I think that I've talked to some security companies who say that this is a nightmare in terms of creating a solution, a security solution that is going to be ensuring that you've got root of trust in everything that you're doing. I think that that is going to be a topic that I'm really interested in hearing about this week. If the companies have something to talk about in terms of how they're looking at secure deployment of this technology, and what their customers are requiring from them in terms of infrastructure security.
And that security becomes really significant at the far edge where you don't actually have physical security. So it might be that it's a photo printing kiosk in a department store, and you don't have physical security. Somebody could relatively easily access that computer that's inside there, and it'll be a fairly powerful computer connected to your network in order to do all of the work. There's a big security hassle around that. Some of these deployments are going to end up in places that are completely unstaffed and public access. And that's totally terrifying for the security team. So yeah, getting that root of trust that's not reliant on physical security of the endpoint is going to be very important.
So without making this sound too much of an ad for Edge Field Day, I think that we are definitely going to hear about a lot of these aspects, whether it's the technology like hyperconvergence or zero trust security, out of band management, networking, secure different networking, container deployment. All of these things are going to be coming up at Edge Field Day, and it's a wonderful field because it does encompass so many different topics. So I guess let's get back to the premise, though, and wrap this up with your final thoughts. The edge is not just the cloud or the data center, right, Enrico?
No, it's not, and we will see more and more, differences in the future because I think we are, just scratching the surface, as I said. So this is the first wave of implementation of real edge because the technology is changing. We have many more opportunities, and there will be a lot of fun, new, interesting technologies coming in the next, few years. Exciting.
Edge, I think, is the most exciting area of technology innovation today. I think it needs to rely on cloud computing technologies to actually deliver the vision of what edge can be for companies, but it's completely different in terms of its implementation.
I think one of the interesting things is going to be seeing that progression from Internet of Things devices that do one tiny thing extremely well through how they're being aggregated at the edge, and then value is upstreaming through into the cloud. And so I think connectivity through this is going to be one of the really crucial things to look at as we're viewing the Edge Field Day event this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the things that I'm really excited about, is to see how we're able to take existing technologies, whether it's Kubernetes or SD-WAN or virtualization, and apply these in a way that addresses the unique challenges at the edge. So please do check out the Edge Field Day presentations Wednesday and Thursday. If you're listening to this after the publication date, you'll find those on YouTube as well. Before we go, one more time, tell us where we can find you and continue this conversation. Enrico?
So you can find me on geekdown.com. You can find there all the write-ups that me and my team write about storage, about Kubernetes, and all the other reports from Geekdown.
Allyson Klein at LinkedIn, at Tech Allison on Twitter, and of course at thetecharena.net.
I'm Alastair Cooke, and you can find me on Demitas, and in New Zealand, so on Twitter as DemitasNZ, or my website is demitas.co.nz, or if you just put Alastair Cooke into Google and try and avoid the cricketer, you should be able to find me.
And I'm Stephen Foskett, and you'll find me at sfoskett on most social media networks, as well as here on the On-Premise podcast, as well as our Utilizing Tech podcast and our weekly Gestalt IT News Rundown. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do subscribe, whether it's in your favorite podcast application or on YouTube, so you don't miss an episode. Please do also give us a rating or a review on that platform, since that does help to spread the word. This podcast was brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise, as well as TechFieldDay.com this episode. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.